So just before I forget, because I usually get to this at the end of the recording, and then I forget about it. I usually leave it till the end. I just want to thank all those people who have been very generous in supporting the channel, and you can go to buy me a coffee / Kabbalah Decoded if you want to join. But in any event, I do appreciate it, and even if I haven't managed to thank you personally, regardless as a personal thank you. In any event, enough of that. Let's get on with the topic. We have been talking about the concept of the world of Tohu and what it represents. The whole concept of the world of Tohu is recorded in the second verse of the first chapter of Genesis, which states, I'll just say the Hebrew first, and then I'll say it in English. V'ha'aretz, ha'aretz means the universe, the created universe. There wasn't yet a physical world of that we live in now. That didn't happen until much later. But whatever it is, it's the universe of universes, the universe of spiritual dimensions, essentially, until um, until physical creation came about. In other words, there's various paradigms of physical of creative existence before the physical world comes into being. They all emerge out of Adam Kadmon, but I don't want to get into all the details of that now. It's a complicated issue, and we're just going to get sidetracked if we go into it now. Maybe another time we'll look at that more in detail. In any event, the second verse of Bereshit, of Genesis, of the first chapter of Genesis, says as follows: "Va'aretz," the universe, "hayeta tohu vavohu," was in a state of void and chaos. Sometimes it's translated the other way around, but I'll explain in a minute why we didn't explain it like that. V'choshech, and darkness al pnei tehom, on the depths, on the deep. And then it goes on to say, "V'ruach Elokim rachefet al pnei hamayim," and the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. And we'll come to that later on in the final lecture. In this series, we'll talk about what that means. In any event, the land, or the not the land, I'm sorry, the creation, the universe, the spiritual universes were in a state of void and chaos. Now, what's the difference between void and chaos? Well, void is that there is no manifestation of godliness. Chaos is that there is a manifestation, it's chaotic, it's not well organized. Darkness is when there is godliness, but it's covered up. And the deep means that however deep you go and however far you search, it's hard to find what you're looking for. I will get into it in much greater detail as we go through each of them. We started explaining the first one, the world of Tohu. Tohu, we explained Midrash is rabbinic literature that um, is not constrained by trying to understand the simple, straightforward meaning of the text, but brings in various associations and allusions and parallel ideas, and tries to see what the connections are between other ideas. In any event, the Medrash comes along and it says that these four situations, called Tohu, the void, Vohu, chaos, Choshech, the darkness, and Al Pnei Tehom, on the face of the deep, these correspond actually to four exiles. Why? Because an exile means some kind of barrier that there is between the soul and God, and that's what exile is all about. And we explained in the first and second classes, we explained that exile in an outward sense, in other words, actual physical exile, comes about as a result of an inner exile, an inner separation from godliness. That's then manifested in exile, and there's four levels or four different manifestations, four types of exile, and these correspond, as we said before, These corresponds to four nations. The first nation is corresponding to Tohu. The word Tohu, which is the void, was the nation of Babylon and the Babylonian exile. The Babylonians were the ones that destroyed the first temple, and their particular klippa. Their klippa means a shell, but a klippa is like you have a shell around the fruit or a peel around the fruit. Some peels are edible and some peels are not edible. Like a banana peel is not edible, as far as I know, anyway. A coconut shell is not edible. But in any event, the idea of klippa is that it prevents you from accessing the fruit and has to be removed. So the same thing is true of spirit of klippa in a spiritual sense. This sort of spiritual barrier that prevents one from getting to the core of what it's all about, and that has to be removed. So the klippa, the covering of that Babylon represents, is the idea of idolatry. What is idolatry? Idolatry is essentially the idea that God is part of the not part of the picture. There isn't an overall overarching creator and power. There are just various other powers, and those powers are worshipped so you can get what you want. Idolatry ultimately leads to a situation of tremendous egotism. It's all about me and all about getting what I want and what I need and what I desire and so on and so forth. And therefore you propitiate, you worship, you sacrifice to this god or to that god or to the other god in order that you should have wealth or you should have crops or you should have whatever, right? But recognition there's no recognition that these are simply subservient powers in the universe, and there's an overarching, all inclusive power, which is what we call the divine God, in other words. So Babylon represented this whole idea of idolatry. And idolatry ultimately leads to self worship. Therefore, the kings in Babylon were regarded, and not only in Babylon, but in other places as well, in Egypt, for example, were regarded as divine. The kings themselves were divine, and anyone who criticized or went against the king or um, um, simply did not do what the king wanted was basically dead meat. They would get rid of him as soon as possible. So that's what it is. In modern terminology, that would be the idea of worshiping things which are not the ultimate, um, worshiping things which are not what your soul is part of. The Tanya, very important Hasidic work, the called the Tanya or Likutei Amarim, but it's most commonly known as the Tanya. Basically, the handbook of Hasidic um, teachings, and especially in the sect known as Chabad or Lubavitch. So in the Tanya, it talks about that the soul is part of God above. Idolatry is worshiping something that the soul is not essentially part of. In other words, worshiping idols in our modern day terminology could be worshiping those people who are not really who should not at all be worshipped. There's some, first of all, they're simply human beings, and second of all, their morals and scruples and so on and so forth are not exactly things to look up to. Pop stars, sports stars, and so on. We can admire them. Um, we can praise them for their tremendous skill at one particular thing or another, but unfortunately, it becomes a kind of a worship, hero worship, and that hero worship is actually very dangerous because it is destructive of the essence of the soul. Worship um, has to be to that to to he she, I don't know how you want to God, in other words, where your soul comes from. All right, so that's the idea of idolatry. I have to switch that off. Sorry about that. Um, that is the first. That's the thing that corresponds the nation that corresponds to the world of Tohu. Um, the second one that corresponds to the word Bohu. Bohu. The first one was void. The second one is chaos. It's chaotic. This corresponds to Media, Media, not media, but Media. The state, the country named Media doesn't exist anymore. In Hebrew, it's called Madai, Madai, Mem Daled Yud, Madai. And Persia. There was an amalgamation of Madai and Persia, Paras and Madai, in the Megillah and Megillat Esther, the famous story of Esther, the scroll of Esther, which you're about to read in just less than a month. The whole story of Purim took place in the kingdom of one named Achashverosh, who was the king. He had combined the kingdoms of Media, and Persia. And that's where the whole story of Purim took place. By conquest, by marriage, by various other things, there were two kingdoms that amalgamated as one, and he was the king of Achashverosh in the Purim story was the king of both of those countries, and in fact, it was the world empire at that time. 127 states, 127 countries were under his rulership, under his Germany. So he was a very, very powerful ruler. What was their klippa? What was their negative quality? The overwhelming negative quality of these people. It wasn't that they lusted. The Talmud tells us it wasn't that they lusted after gold and silver, after wealth. They didn't even lust after power. They lusted after lust. In other words, they lusted after um, sexual activity called pritzut. It's a lust for women. In other words, lust, what's the difference between lust and normal relationships? Lust is an over an overpowering desire for the act without the feeling behind it. The overpowering desire for the act, the sexual act, without the emotional connection between the two partners, between the husband and the wife, let's say, which is obviously the ideal situation between the husband and the wife. So that lust led to the whole concept of having harems. There was a harem. And Achashverosh, as the story is told in Purim, had his harem and was populated by um, many women and younger women, older women, girls, and to the extent that he would switch them from day to day, and he didn't come to the end of them in like 180 days. I forget exactly what it was. I think 180 days. In other words, he had 180 concubines, and besides his wives. So he was a very busy man, but he was busy with his procreation. Well, no, I'm sorry, that's incorrect. He was busy not with procreation. He was busy with enjoying himself. He was busy with lusting after sexual activity with no emotional attachment involved. That is all until, and we see that actually in the story of Purim, when the men, because that's the way things happened in those days, the men were feasting for 180 days. And then eventually at the 180th day, 180th day, he brought his wife. He offered to show his wife, whose name was Vashti. He offered to show her nude in front of all his buddies, all his drinking partners. They were drunk for 180 days. You can imagine what that is like how drunk he was after 180 days of partying. Um, and So he calls in his wife and tells her to, to strip in front of the men. That was, as far as he was concerned, that was perfectly okay. because lust was the order of the day. There was no, there was no, there was nothing beyond that. And if she refused, then was therefore put to death. And then he made a beauty contest to choose the most beautiful woman in the kingdom to be his wife, and that turned out to be Esther, to replace Vashti. But anyway, you can see the idea of pritzut, just lust without love, and what that was all about. So that was the state, the kingdom of Media and Persia. Now let's just try and understand like what that means in terms of ourselves. Like how do we relate to such a thing? Well, I think there are people who understand this very well. They call such people addicted. People have addictions. Even people who are perfectly normal have addictions. Some of those addictions are to alcohol, to drugs, and so on and so forth. They become chemical addictions, but there's an addiction as well to a sexual addiction, which is much more difficult to cure than or to deal with than drug addictions and things like that. Why? Because drug addictions are really by introducing um, a foreign object into your body, right? Alcohol, drugs, and so on and so forth. But a lust for something which is actually a natural power of the body, the power of procreation, which is what it should be used for, is um, much more difficult to control, especially since the way to control addiction generally is, according to Alcoholics Anonymous and various such like groups, Narcotics and Narcotics Anonymous, is to completely cut off all use of those things. But to become completely celibate is not really it's not really a possibility, especially amongst Jewish people, because there's a commandment. In fact, the first commandment in the Torah, the first commandment in the Bible is to be fruitful and multiply, to have a family, to be fruitful and multiply. And there's no other way of being fruitful and multiplying other than having relations, sexual relations. Well, I suppose you could you could use test tube, but nevertheless, we're not talking about unusual situations like that. But so the idea, therefore, is the addiction to such a thing can be very difficult to deal with. What's the way of dealing with it? The way of dealing with it is restricting it to certain times and only with one person. Generally, that's the way of dealing with it, and that person obviously one should be married to a spouse. Now, this is the world called bohu. Now, the word bohu in Hebrew, if you look at the word bohu, I'm going to get the whiteboard over here. The word bohu is spelled like this. I'm going to write it in script. Bohu. It's just easier to see that way. That's hey, beit hey, well, bohu, right? And bohu. That's how you spell it. Bohu. But the pronunciation is that you say it with a choilem. A choilem means that mark on the top over there, bo. So it could be written, if you read it write in the plene form, what's called the plene form, the full form, right? Then it would be written like this. It's not written like this in the Torah because the Torah very often uses the chaser form or the what's it called in English? Defective form, yeah, the defective form. But in the plene form, when it's written, I'm sorry, that's incorrect. When it's written in the plene form, it's written like this: bohu. Now, in Hebrew, one of the remarkable things about Hebrew, one of the beautiful things about Hebrew is that you can see certain concepts within words when you break them into constituent parts. So this word can actually be the word bohu, when it's written out in full, can be spelt as two words, bo, who. In it is he. Who's he? He is the Almighty, the Divine. In it is he. In other words, in the concept of procreation, there is divinity, there's godliness. It's ultimately supposed to be a godly act. The sexual act is supposed to be a godly act. It's the way we reproduce the divine image. In a sense, anything that reproduces is using a divine power to reproduce. And if you think about it, it is actually a pretty miraculous thing that all of a sudden, a sperm cell and a female ovum come together, and all of a sudden that turns into a human being. It turns into a human. It's a miraculous thing, and of course, it works with animals as well. But animals do it in an animalistic way. Animals are animals. But here you're talking about a miraculous process, and it really is miraculous if you think about it. The whole process of giving birth, of becoming pregnant and giving birth is a wondrous thing. It's an amazing thing, and the more one thinks about it, the more amazing it is. So, without going into it in any great detail, we understand that this gift, the gift of being able to reproduce, has godliness within it. As it says in the second chapter of Tanya, which I mentioned before, that quoting from the sages say as follows, that the woman provides the egg, the ovum, the man provides the sperm, and God provides the soul. In other words, the life force that eventually animates that human being that will be born. Now, when animals are born, they also become alive, so they have a life force, but they don't have a soul. They don't have consciousness. Consciousness is something that is extremely rare in the world, and we don't know really what the consciousness of animals is. They've tried to figure it out, but they can't even define human consciousness, which is much more prevalent and much more manifested than animal consciousness, if there is any. So in any event, it's very, very hard to decide, to define, but that consciousness we call the soul. The soul is conscious of, or can become conscious of divinity. The soul is a part of God above, right? Part of God. That's what it's called in Tanya in the second chapter. The soul is part of God above, and therefore it is conscious. And that was in fact one of the very first transgression, the very first sin in the Garden of Eden, was taking that consciousness that was supposed to be the divine consciousness and burying it in desire. In the story in Genesis, it's Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and they ate from a forbidden fruit. What was the forbidden fruit? The forbidden fruit wasn't a fruit. It wasn't an apple, and it wasn't a. It was the tree of knowledge of good and evil. There's knowledge, and there's consciousness. Knowledge is facts. And that's what they went into. They went into the news forecast instead. Well, that's not facts either, but it used to be once upon a time. It used to be it used to be facts, right? So they went into the idea of existing facts without awareness, without consciousness of what was behind those facts. In other words, that Bo in it, who was he? In it was he. That's so the chaotic point of it, the chaotic aspect of it is that it becomes very external. It becomes external pleasure instead of an expression of internal love. That's what sex is. If it's just that, if it's not an expression of internal love, then it's just intimacy. That's all. You can't even call it intimacy. It's sex. Intimacy is when there's emotions involved. There's me involved. There's my soul involved. There's our souls involved. The two souls become one in the child that's produced, if one is fortunate enough to be able to bring forth children. But in any event, that sexual act is meant to be an experience of the divine, an experience of godliness. Therefore, in that act, we say, Bohu, he is in it, he's in there. But unfortunately, in Adam and Eve's foolishness, they sufficed with external pleasures and subsequently had to cover themselves up. Why? Because they got involved with shame, right? Initially, there was no shame. They were not ashamed. There was no concept of shame. What is shame? Shame is complete self awareness, awareness of self. In other words, um, not awareness of self as a part of God above, not awareness of self as part of the divine, but awareness of self as something separate. That's where shame comes in. Shame is I'm separate. I'm outside the community. I'm outside the culture. I'm outside the framework of things. I'm outside of divinity, and therefore they had to cover themselves up. That was when they tore leaves and they made themselves coverings for their genitalia. So that is the concept of Madai and Paras, Media and and Persia, lust for sexual encounters without any further investment of emotions and ultimately the investment of binding two souls together to produce a third soul. Nevertheless, the act is potentially, even now, the act is potentially a holy act, which is why in Jewish tradition, Jewish religious tradition, in the Torah tradition, one confines the sexual act to Friday nights. Other times as well, but particularly to Friday night, because that's the Sabbath. It's the holiest time of the week, and therefore it's the time to indulge, not to indulge, to partake of, to be involved in the potentially holiest of acts. That's when two souls come together, two beings come together, not only in a spiritual sense, some kind of spiritual communion, but even in a physical communion, because the physical union, the conjunction of the male and female body together is also part of holiness. In other words, that's the manifestation of oneness in the physical world. It's a manifestation of oneness in the physical world. So that's what bohu represents. And of course, the opposite of the idea of holiness is just a completely unaware moment of enjoyment. It's like prostituting oneself. And that's in fact that's the paradigm. The paradigm of Persia and Media was that they had these harems of women that any time the king would each one had their day or their turn or their day in the year, day in the week, whenever it was, and they went to the king. Um, there was no He probably didn't even know their name. And interestingly enough, Esther kind of turned that around to a certain extent with Hashverosh. I think I mentioned last time that there are various opinions as to whether it was actually Esther herself, whether she actually married him. The simple, straightforward meaning is that she did actually marry him and lived with him, even though she was a Jewish woman and he was a non-Jewish emperor. There's all kinds of questions that raises, but nevertheless, that's the simple, straightforward meaning. The Arizal explains that Esther was never with Achashverosh. Mordechai, who was her uncle and actually her husband, he was a distant relative. He wasn't a close uncle. He was a more distant uncle, like a third uncle or whatever, something like that. Anyway, he was an uncle, and he married her. She was an orphan, and so he married her, and he was a master, um, a saintly, a very saintly person, and therefore a master of the secret arts of Kabbalah. And he created a shade. He created a what would you call it? A spirit that looked exactly like Esther, a clone. He created a spiritual clone of Esther that took on physical form, and that's who lived with Achashverosh, not Esther herself, according to the Arizal. um, how does the type of Babylonian lusted for King David's lust for Bathsheba? Yes, and David admitted. You're right. Very good question, Ben. Um, David admitted that his lust for Bathsheba, even though he was permitted to marry her afterwards, but he should have waited. He should have waited. He should have waited. She was Bathsheba, and he realized this, and he couldn't control himself. But Bathsheba, who he married eventually, and that's she was the mother of Solomon, Shlomo. Bathsheba was destined for David from the beginning of creation, but he should have waited for her. He should have waited until either her husband divorced her or left her or was or died or whatever it was, and then he would have had her um, legitimately. What he did was her husband was Uriah. He sent away Uriah into the battlefront, and Uriah was killed in the front lines of battle. And he did that in order that David did that in order that he would marry Bathsheba. Afterwards, when he repented for it, but the prophet told him that anyway he should continue the marriage because she was destined for to him from the beginning of creation. A strange story and a disturbing story in many ways, but there's one would have to go into all the details to be able to explain it properly. But that is the situation. And Ben asks further, didn't Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines? I don't know if it's exactly 700 and 300. It could be. I don't remember the numbers exactly. Yes, he did, and he was punished for it. Um, David had set up the system that a man may have no more than 18 wives. Now, one is enough as far as I'm concerned, but in those days it was very common for men to have more than one wife, and he put a limit on it. And Solomon thought he was smarter than his father, and he went way overboard. And as a result, his wives led him astray. In any event, yes, we're not condoning what Solomon did. The fact that he had so many concubines and so many wives and so on, it was not a good thing at all. It was exactly the opposite of what he should have done. Um, I do think that one of these days we're going to see a return to this kind of situation where a man marries more than one wife because there are more women in the world than there are men. I don't know why that is. Probably because men do more dangerous jobs and things like that. And there's a higher death rate amongst men at a younger age. And I do think at some point in time, certainly in certain countries, that there may be a return. And if you say, well, in America, it's not going to happen because it's a Christian country, there's a lot of things that are happening in America, despite the fact that it's a Christian country. So I don't know if yeah, you Sasson, you're right. And now we would need more work. Yeah, right. But it's just a prediction. I don't think it's going to happen in the next 5 years, 10 years, but it could happen in the next 20, 30, 40 years. Um, we'll see. Yeah, the wars, military men, the military takes men away too soon. Yeah, people die in wars and so on and so forth. Yeah. In any event, let's not get into that now. Let's focus on the next idea. More credit cards, right? Um, interestingly enough, the sages tell us that a man's parnasa, he makes a living according to the needs of his wife, according to the necessities of his wife. So I guess if you have more than one wife, you have several channels open to you of earning yourself earning a living. But yeah, I'm not suggesting it's necessarily a good thing. I think in today's world, one wife is probably more than enough for most men. Um, and of course, then there's the whole issue of what they call tsarot, when the two wives and the wives are in competition of one sort or another, even if they're very holy people in themselves, but it's a natural thing, come to competition. In any event, okay. So that was the second klippa, which was called tohu, which was called vohu, and it's called vohu because there is godliness potentially there, except it's covered over. It's covered over in outward lust rather than in inward connection. Um, so the Torah influenced these tzaddiks through the sexual desire, or certainly with Solomon that was the case. Yeah, I mean, was there something behind his sexual desire? What was behind his Solomon's sexual desire was to increase, to spread his seed, so that the seed of wisdom which he contained, Solomon was the wisest man who ever lived, that the seeds of wisdom would be spread far and wide. But unfortunately, that wisdom got diluted into all kinds of other endeavors. Um, so, yes, he was influenced negatively. Even the biggest tzaddik, if he's not careful, can be influenced negatively. King Solomon was not known as a tzaddik, he was known as an extremely wise person, extremely wealthy, extremely effective, very, very insightful, but nevertheless could be led astray. Tzaddik, the word tzaddik actually in Hebrew, the word tzaddik, which we usually translate as a righteous person or a saintly person, in Kabbalah, the word tzaddik actually corresponds to the sphira of Yesod. Yesod is the male and female sexual organ. So a tzaddik is one who controls his desires in that department. Um, Now, when we say control his desires, doesn't mean that he's celibate, he or she is celibate. To be celibate in Judaism is actually um, against the Torah. It's not at all, because there's the commandment of pru and revu, to be fruitful and multiply. And as I mentioned before, and therefore celibacy is not regarded as a good thing. In fact, there was a person called a Nazir, a Nazarite. A Nazarite swore off um, wine and various other things, and he couldn't come into any contact with impurity. And eventually, the Nazarite has to bring a sacrifice and offering in the temple to expiate his sin of not um, deriving benefit from this world. So this whole idea of nazirut, of becoming, celibate and forswearing the world is not the way of Torah, and it's certainly not the way of the Hasidic approach to Torah. Yes, it's possible for a certain period of time to do these things, to be celibate, or to forego indulging in wine, or even indulging in fasts and things like that. I don't know if you can call it indulging, but participating in fasting and so on and so forth. But it's not regarded as a good thing. It's regarded as a necessity sometimes, in some cases, for some people, but generally that's not what the Almighty wants from us. It's not what God wants from us. He wants us to enjoy the world in a careful and conscious way. All right. So let's go on to the next one. The next one is the the next aspect of the world of Tohu is called Choshech. Again, there's Tohu and Vohu and Choshech. Choshech means darkness. Darkness. The nation that corresponded to this darkness was actually the Greek nation, the nation of Greece. Now, the whole movement that the Greeks started was essentially called the Enlightenment, right? So how can you call it darkness? Because it was knowledge without wisdom, as we mentioned before. Knowledge without wisdom, or the lust for knowledge. And Greek philosophers and mathematicians were basically unparalleled in history. The depth of their understanding, the depth of their knowledge was just incredible. Given that we're talking about like 2,000 years ago, more than 2,000 years ago. I mean, all the famous philosophers, Socrates, Plato, scientists, Archimedes, and Pythagoras, the Pythagorean theorem, and many, 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 many others. I just can't remember all the names. They were unbelievably knowledgeable of the movement of planets, of mathematics, and they didn't even have a number system like we do. They didn't have a proper decimal number system. They used some other system that was very, very tedious and unwieldy and so on to use, but somehow they managed. And tremendous, tremendous intellect. They were intellectuals of huge stature, no question about it. Um, Greek philosophy is still studied today. The works of Plato, the works of Aristotle, even how to live your life. Aristotle wrote lots about that, and so did Plato. Socrates didn't write, but Plato was his scribe, and many, many other of the greatest philosophers from that time, Ptolemy, philosophers and scientists, very great. The problem was that it was knowledge without wisdom. It was the lust for knowledge, but there was no godliness in it. And therefore no light. It was darkness. They were uh, groping around in the dark, essentially, which is why we light candles on Hanukkah. Hanukkah was when um, the Greeks defiled the temple and defiled all the oils, and they didn't destroy the oil. They defiled it, because defiling something, making it tome, making it spiritually impure, is something that can't be measured scientifically. It's not a scientific concept. So they precisely, that's exactly what they did. They dafka went and made the oil spiritually impure, so that, because their idea was that the Jews should be able, you keep your customs, keep the laws, any laws that you want, but don't say that these laws come from a place of a place transcending the intellect. There is nothing higher than intellect, they said. The intellect is supreme, and therefore keep all of the laws that you want, all of the laws that you say were given to you by God. Keep them, but keep them for logical reasons. Have a reason for doing them, otherwise you don't do them. And therefore, when they destroyed the temple, when they entered the temple and defiled the temple, they defiled the oil. And the miracle was that they found that the Jews found a jar of oil was only enough to burn for one night. And that jar of oil burned for 8 days miraculously. Somehow or another, it burned for 8 days, showing the idea of miracle, which transcends, it defies explanation. Oil that would usually last for one day is not going to last for 8 days. Might last a little longer than one day, but not much more than that. Lasted for 8 days, and the light, because it was used, that oil was used to light the menorah, the candelabra in the temple, which is one of the daily rituals that had to be done, lighting the candelabra. And it had to be done with pure oil. And they found this one jar of pure oil hidden under the floor that hadn't been tampered with. And that's what they used. And so that was to symbolize for them that the purity that they were seeking was still intact. It had not been completely defiled by the Greeks. But this was the idea of of knowledge without wisdom. Knowledge without wisdom is impure knowledge. In other words, knowledge without the understanding that there's a godly purpose to this knowledge, there's a godly direction in which it should lead. We're not just talking about being like a starstruck, religious fanatic. We're just talking about acknowledging that there is that which transcends human intellect. Human intellect is not all knowing and all seeing and all understanding and so on and so forth. We have to acknowledge at some point in time that human intellect, however vast and however competent it is nevertheless limited. There's an intellect that transcends, there's mind that transcends the human mind, i.e., the mind of God. And that's what the whole story of Hanukkah is all about. When they overcame the Greeks and they drove them out of the temple in a miraculous way as well. Even the war itself against the Greeks was miraculous, because it was really a handful of Kohanim, of priests, that drove them out of the temple and eventually drove them out of the land. It was a miraculous victory in a war that shouldn't have happened. These people were not; they were priests in a temple. What do they know about battle, about fighting, and about the art of war and so on? And these Greek soldiers were trained, and they were vastly outnumbered the number of priests that rebelled. But nevertheless, somehow or another, under the leadership of Judah the Maccabee, they um, they managed to somehow or another drive the Greeks out of the land. They rededicated the temple, and they lit the menorah with a pure oil, and then afterwards they managed to took 8 days to get more pure, to produce more pure oil, which they did, and then continued to light. So the idea, therefore, of knowledge is insufficient if there's no light to that knowledge. That light is a divine light. In other words, knowledge is not good enough to have imbibed or digested the tree of knowledge. One has to have the tree of life, which transcends the tree of knowledge, the tree of life. In other words, the tree of wisdom, which um, transcends just knowledge and information. And that's why actually wisdom is always referred to as not always. It's very often referred to in terms of light. Chochmas Adam Ta'ir Panov, right? The wisdom of a person lights up his face. You can often see in certain saintly people, very holy people, that they have this sort of glow about them, and it's a very ethereal glow. It's got nothing to do with the color of their skin or whatever it is. It's you see it in paintings, like in many of the famous paintings in the world. You see they sort of paint this halo around. Well, that's like as a very, very sort of coarse representation of it. But you see with certain people that they have this godly glow about them, right? They have this glow that can be reproduced, and it can't be. It's something you either have or you don't. It's one of those things that in times of being uplifted spiritually, Chochmas Adam, a person's wisdom, then lights up his countenance. Uh, and So, therefore, light was the perfect analogy for this type of um, spiritual energy, wisdom. And that was exactly what Yavan, Greece, wanted to get rid of. As far as they were concerned, wisdom had to be based on logic. It had to be based on facts. It had to be based on provable things. It couldn't be based on ethereal, beyond human intellect ideas. There was nothing more supreme than the intellect as far as they were concerned. And so the same thing you could say is true in our day and age, at least to some extent, that the people that lust after knowledge, but they don't lust equally after wisdom. They want the facts. They want to accumulate tremendous amount of knowledge without necessarily, a Wikipedia kind of thing, with very often little wisdom. And that is the clipper, the negative shell, the destructive shell of the that's represented by Greece and darkness. That's why it's called darkness, because it attempts to get rid of that light that transcends ordinary human intellect. All right, I think we'll stop here. And next time around, we'll do the final one, the Pnei HaTahom, the deep, on the face of the deep. The B'choshech al Pnei HaTahom, the darkness on the face of the deep. And that is the power of Edom. Edom is ultimately Rome, the power that's power without humility and compassion. That's just lust for power itself. All right. Any questions, ladies and gentlemen?